Well, welcome everybody to the MA Art Business program. We decided that it would be a good idea for me to record a preliminary lecture, which is a brief history of the art market. And I've divided this into two parts. So I'm going to begin now with the period from prehistory to medieval. This talk is because of my background and my knowledge and research. Obviously, this is quite Western-centric and maybe London-centered, but you will see that I have attempted to be inclusive throughout the lectures. So to begin, so arguably, art has always been a commodity to be exchanged or bought and sold in local or international markets. The earliest surviving three-dimensional art objects, barely distinguishable from natural pebbles from which they were carved, are images of apparently pregnant women, such as on the slide, the Venus of Berikat Ram, discovered in 1981 in the Golan Heights, Israel, dating to the Stone Age. These statuettes are named after the much later historical Roman goddess of female sexuality and beauty, Venus, and are usually interpreted as fertility goddesses with a probable function within primitive religious ritual. You bury them in the soil, and the soil goddess gives back crops. However, in spite of this apparent functionality, it's quite possible that the artist, if that's what we can call the person who made this, might have received goods or perhaps time in exchange for their production of the object, and therefore the very basic conditions of an art market, with the art object created as an exchange commodity by part-time or perhaps full-time artisans, are present in prehistory. Furthermore, the provenance of these Stone Age Venuses is scattered throughout a massive chronological period and across a widespread geographical area. They can date from 500,000 BCE to 20,000 BCE, and their provenance from India and Africa through to the Mediterranean, Europe, and Russia. Therefore, this is evidence, in my opinion, if not for an international art trade, at least for a widely shared intercultural notion about the subject, style, and function of art. So the modern idea of an international branded art style is certainly present, albeit in latent form, in prehistory. However, it's impossible to identify the emergence of a culture of collecting, i.e. the modern idea of individuals or corporations acquiring numbers of works of art for art's sake, and therefore competing with one another and initiating variable market value until well into the historical period. Comparable symbolic traditions can be found in the Bhimbetka rock shelters in India. We can see this here in the slide. This is actually a photograph, and there's an inset showing the location of this in the north of India. These wonderful caves with these very, very early paintings, and you can see they're figurative. They've got human and animal figures as early as this, and they're painted with some kind of implement, maybe some kind of early brush, with natural pigments. And we also find symbolic artistic references such as the Venus statues in the cave paintings of Sulawesi in Indonesia. Again, I've inset a map just to remind you of the positioning of Indonesia and Sulawesi. And these cave paintings also reflect early aesthetic and ritual practices. And these examples reinforce the idea of a globally shared visual language in prehistory, because these kind of cave paintings, I've given examples from the East, from India, or the East as seen from the West, India and in Indonesia, but they also appear in South America and Africa and so on. The way these were made, by the way, we believe that you can see this is like a wild pig boar, some kind of wild animal, maybe now extinct. They probably hunt for food And these hands are typical, and we believe that they're made by the artists would actually fill their mouth with the red mineral pigment, and then probably with a little straw, kind of shoot it around their hand, a little bit like modern spray paint, which is often used by today's street artists. So in this prehistoric period, and by the way, what we mean by prehistory is before history, which in historia is a word meaning writing. So it's before there are written records which can tell us more about the practices, for example, of religious ritual and art. So all we have is the objects and their find spots, their proveniences as opposed to provenances, to help us. But in this period, although there's no evidence of art being produced purely as art, functional art objects such as precious metal and terracotta drinking equipment and fine jewelry are discovered hundreds of miles from their place of manufacture, suggesting the presence of an art market in the modern sense of the term. At the start of Western history, in the Greek epic poetry of Homer, who was living in the 8th century BCE, decorative art objects such as gold and silver wine cups and bowls function as valuable exchange gifts between royal aristocratic dynasties. Maxine Berg, in her book on luxury, dated to 2015, it's in the bibliography in this lecture, argues, quote, that the fascination of Europe's 18th century monarchs, courts, and elites with fabulous wealth, exotic flora and fauna, and exquisitely crafted fine luxury goods goes back to what we call the Bronze Age in prehistory. So here you can see the famous gold mask from beaten gold mask that was placed over the head of a skeleton in a burial in the ancient Greek city of Mycenae. It's dated about 1400 BCE and is now in the Athens National Museum. And the romantic archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann that first discovered this in excavations in the 19th century said, I have now gazed upon the face of Agamemnon, because Agamemnon was the king of Mycenae in Homer's famous writings that were being read by everybody in Western culture in the 18th and 19th and into the 20th centuries. In the Indus Valley, in India and ancient China, trade in decorated ceramics and jade objects similarly suggests the commodification of art for elite exchange, with stylistic motifs traveling and shared across regions. So, painted ceramic bowls of the early Harappan phase, round about early to mid-third millennium BCE, are found across a wide area of Baluchistan, Sindh, and the Indus Valley. You can make these out in the inset of the slide, and you will have access to these slides so you can focus in on these. And there are closely related styles at sites such as Dam Sadat, Mehrgarh, and Raymonderi. Their presence in regions with distinct local pottery traditions suggests they were traded or exchanged rather than locally produced. By the way, we can work out where, for example, ceramic, terracotta, clay ceramics have been made because we can take a small sample from a pot like this and test it, and we get this thing called spectrometry, which gives us a computerized readout, printout of all the minerals and their percentages in the overall composition. And we then keep a data bank of where these different clays with these different minerals are across the world. And that enables us, using these modern technologies, to locate the provenience of the clay. So you often find a clay object a long way from where it was made. So these vessels may have travelled along early overland and riverine trade routes that also carried shell, semi-precious stones, and copper, serving either as valued objects in their own right or as containers for other goods. And now an example from China, and these are these famous objects in prehistory called bidiscs. See the spelling in the slide there, and again I've inset the regions of China, and you can focus in on the slide on your own later on to see some of the geographical regions I'm referring to. So, although most of these discs were made in the Liangzhu culture heartland around Lake Tai, which is on the map round about here, um, many have been found far beyond this core area of eastern China, including in Shangzhou, the Middle Yangtze and Yellow River valley sites. These often are traded along rivers, obviously. Petrographic, or the analysis of stone, shows that the nephrite and jade that these are made of often came from distant quarries, indicating long distance raw material transport. So there are ways that modern technology can also test minerals and stone and find out where they've come from. Finished discs also move through elite gift exchange networks, appearing in high status burials outside of Liangzhu territory. Even centuries after this Liangzhu culture's decline, and you can see it dates there really early, and earlier discs continued to circulate, valued as prestigious antiquities in later societies. So there's another dimension to our understanding of the way the art world and its markets operated in prehistory, that these objects were not just being commodified and traded at sharing culture, if you like, maybe being used for gift exchange, as we believe these discs often were, but the same discs are found in much later tombs in China and other regions where they made their way to, suggesting that these were antiques that were collected by later cultures, just like today's art market still has very, very strong collectors interested in antiques. By the early 6th century BCE, Athenian artists in Greece, in the Mediterranean, are beginning to sign their works. This is the first time in the whole history of world art. Signatures, we take them for granted today. This marks a sea change in the history of the art market. If the lowly artisan class, so for example, the person that would have made this terracotta wine mixing bowl, now in the British Museum, found hundreds of miles from Athens, where it was made, in northern Italy in an Etruscan tomb. We'll come back to that. So these were made by people who worked with their hands, and Greek ancient aristocrats, it's a Greek word, by the way, meaning rule of the nobility. They never worked with their hands. So anyone who worked with their hands, including artisans and artists, was considered lower class. So if this lowly artisan class has been encouraged to individualize their products by signing them, then a new, more respecting relationship has developed between artists and their higher class patrons, and a new spirit of competition has emerged between artists with one another and between owners of these works and one another. Once such a system evolves, of course, the dynamics of artistic production shift to a competitive marketplace in which the buyer is willing to pay higher prices for the works of certain named, we might say today, branded artists over and above other artists. And it's significant that these early signatures dating back to the 6th century BCE, such as this vase, I'll show you the signature in a moment, that these coincide with the emergence of democratic political discourse in the city-state of Athens, and that the early 5th century stylistic revolution from archaic Egyptian style flat forms, two-dimensional painted forms, to illusionary three-dimensional figures takes place soon afterwards. So I'm just going to show, so basically the signature appears on the top of this pot, and there it is. It says Sophilos Mengrafson, which means Sophilos painted me. That in itself is very interesting. These ancient art objects are speaking to us. It's almost as though the people who collected them and the artists believed that they were almost magical objects with a being of their own that speak to us. So Sophilos painted me. And here is an example of Egyptian painting, very, very flat, very two-dimensional, frontal eyes, not very naturalistic. And then we begin to see the emergence in these ancient Greek, particularly Athenian, what we call vases, of three-dimensionality. So artists in Athens begin to boast that they're superior to their peers. The vase painter Euthymides, for example, seen here in detail, this detail of the vase I've just shown you, inscribed this wine amphora with, quote, "This is better than the work of Euphronius." It was inscribed down this side of this figure. Can't see it on the slide. And significantly, he wrote this beside the earliest surviving painting of a three-quarter view human torso. Do you see this figure using it all, not using light and shade and mixing pigments with chiaroscuro, with light and shade, but just using linear perspective so that the left pec is smaller than the right pec. This gives us the view of the illusion that we're looking across a three-quarter view of the body. Likewise, the exaggerated drapery around his arm suggests that that arm is coming out into the viewer's space. This figure in the middle, for the first time in art history, has a twisted spinal column. Early, these are early examples of artists attempting to create an illusion of a real world on the other side of the picture plane. But that boast, this is better than the work of Euphronius, basically he's referring to another artist called Euphronius working in Athens. So he's competing with the other artist. So the modern idea of the artist, an international Bohemian culture hero, we can see also begins in this period. So when we read literary sources about paintings that haven't survived, so the ancient Greeks had what today we call easel paintings and panel paintings painted on wood. None of them have survived, but we read about them in the literary sources. So the 5th century BCE painter, Greek painter Zeuxis, that's Zeuxis, he was born in a Greek colony in southern Italy, but he was in such demand that he traveled the Mediterranean world, eventually working for the King of Macedonia in northern Greece. He won the freedom of cities and, like a modern boxing champion, had his name embroidered in gold on the back of his cloak. And in a competition with another painter, Parrhasius, he famously painted a boy with a bunch of grapes, in which the grapes were so realistically portrayed that real birds flew down to eat them. The artist complained that had the boy been portrayed more realistically, he would have scared the birds away. And when Parrhasius, the other artist, revealed that the curtain draped across his own painting was itself painted, Zeuxis surrendered the prize to him, stating that he had only fooled the birds, whilst Parrhasius had fooled the great artist himself. So it's apparent that the new competitive spirit of this classical Greek art market arena stimulated stylistic and aesthetic change. This phenomenon of market-led contemporary artistic development returns in the Renaissance and again in our own times, when public museums, which as academically objective institutions should be the tastemakers, seek to acquire many young artists' works only when they begin to sell for millions to private collectors. So the early works of Damien Hirst, a modern Zeuxis, and Tracy Emin were constantly rejected by Tate Modern in London until the advertising mogul and art collector Charles Saatchi began to buy them for his private collection. So here we are, a little quote from myself. The modern idea of the artist as an international bohemian culture hero also begins in this ancient Greek period. Zeuxis walks around strutting his stuff. He may be working class, but he's made loads of money, so much so that he can afford to wear a cloak with his name embroidered in gold on the back. And we see Damien Hirst and Tracy Emin both used to behave badly. Maybe they still do. But this was part of the brand that they created when Charles Saatchi began to collect their work in the late 1980s and 1990s, and the rest is history. They became internationally famous and are still pretty big on the art market, as you will learn on the program. Similar developments occurred in ancient China, where scroll painters cultivated personal styles and inscriptions, and in the Islamic world, where calligraphers and illuminators signed their manuscripts and competed for court commissions. This hand scroll, one of the finest surviving works attributed to Gu Kaixi, pardon my pronunciation, depicts 9 scenes from an original 12 from Zhang Hua's 3rd century moralizing text. the admonition scroll, as we call it, instructing imperial consorts in virtue, restraint, and proper conduct. It bears numerous seals and colophons from later collectors, in red here, and emperors. They're all putting their branding the ancient object with their marks, including emperors like Huizong and Qianlong, collectors and emperors, marking its long imperial history. The scroll was purchased eventually by the British Museum in 1903 from Captain Johnson, who had acquired it in Beijing during the Boxer Rebellion. And this is an issue of the ethics of taking art during wartime that will be revisited in my history and revisited a lot on the program, because we have to look out for this kind of material when we're advising people whether they can buy an object or not. Originally, this was painted in the 5th to 7th century CE, and it's closely related to another version that now remains in the Palace Museum in Beijing. And then in Safavid Persia, in the Middle East, as we see it, Qurans, the Muslim religious text of the highest quality, were often collaborative masterpieces, bringing together the most accomplished calligraphers and illuminators. This example, signed by Jalal ibn Muhammad Bakalinjar al-Dalami, pardon my pronunciation, shares stylistic features with the celebrated Chester Beatty Ruzbihan Quran, suggesting a common Shirazi workshop. Its dazzling palette of lapis lazuli, gold, lavender, and a striking fluorescent orange enriches intricate arabesques, surah headings, and cloud bands pricked with gold. Such manuscripts were luxury commissions, sometimes for courtly patrons, reflecting both the devotional and competitive worlds of Safavid book arts, where signatures affirmed an artist's standing and skill. You'll notice that this went up for sale earlier this year at Sotheby's in London. It was estimated for 250 to 300,000 pounds, a massive amount of money for a manuscript, and it remained unsold, unfortunately. Greek artists, coming back to ancient Greek in the West, exported their work to cities across the Mediterranean. The better preserved surviving vases made in Athens, as I've already said, with local Athenian clay, were excavated in northern Italy because the Etruscans imported them and deposited them in their rock-cut tombs, where they're often very well preserved. Some scholars believe that this is evidence of a secondary market. You'll learn what we mean by primary, secondary, tertiary markets on the programme. So it's evidence of a secondary market with out-of-fashion vases sold on by their Athenian primary owners and then resold to foreign buyers. If this is the case, then the art market of classical Athens, some 2,500 years ago, bears a striking resemblance to the contemporary art market, with evidence of competitive patrons vying for the work of the best artists, supply and demand issues, individualistic artists, primary and secondary markets, export and import. You're going to learn more about that in legal and ethical terms. There's also a scholarly argument that the terracotta vases, which now sell for tens of thousands of pounds on the current art market, are actually inferior copies of precious metal archetypes, such as the one you're seeing in this slide. And that they were purchased by a bourgeoisie, a middle class, who couldn't afford authentic gold, silver, or bronze originals purchased by the aristocracy, such as the famous Deveni gilt bronze crater, as it's called in the slide. If this theory is correct, then the modern hierarchy of authenticity and replication, with originals and copies and their respective price differentials, is also a feature of this ancient classical art market. Looking at the slide, you can see that this is an exquisite object. It's bronze, covered in gold, and you can see this incredible naturalistic artwork with this little satyr, this rustic follower of the god of wine, Dionysus, Roman Bacchus, holding on to his wineskin, his animal wineskin, and you can see he's swooning, and he's naked, and he's erotic, and he's drunk, as is his female companion on the right of the vase. By the way, you can learn more about these characters, particularly the female Maenads or Bacchantes, as they're known. If you in the National Theatre in London, in the autumn, fall, has a production of an ancient Greek tragedy called the Bacchae by Euripides. It's going to be a modern production. And I really recommend that you go and see this to understand what's going on in the Greek imagination in this period. Unfortunately, there's little evidence from this period of actual monetary prices, but inscriptions relating to the pay of sculptors working on the frieze, originally running along here, of this temple on the Athenian Acropolis, the Erechtheium Temple, with its famous caryatid porch. Um, these inscriptions now in the British Museum, as unfortunately as one of these caryatids, that we'll learn more about that, about Elgin and the Parthenon marbles. It's a huge international subject, of course, about provenance and ownership. Um, so the inscriptions relating to the pay of the sculptors working on the frieze of this building indicate that prices were correlated, very interestingly and differently to today, with the amount of time spent working on making an art object. For example, a sculptor was paid twice as much for an adult figure, a larger figure on the frieze, as for a child, a smaller, more diminutive figure. This would account for the multiplicity of fine and often miniature details found on many of the signed vases, signifying the consumption of time during their production, and therefore of probable increased monetary value. This is a vase signed by this great, what we call black figure, Athenian vase painter Ezekias, now in the Vatican, this one. It was a wine container found in Etruria. That's why it's in the Vatican, Rome. And you can see the incredible details that were actually scratched out with like a stylus metal pen out of this black paint, for want of a better word, to give these fantastic aristocratic details of luxury cloaks on the objects of Achilles and Ajax that are seen playing a game before they go out to battle. The idea of the art collection in the modern sense of a public or private display of art objects primarily for the sake of their aesthetic and or investment properties developed after the death of Alexander the Great. His dates were 356 to 323 BCE, during a period that we call the Hellenistic and Roman periods, which are 3rd century BCE to 4th century BCE. Um, Here's a mosaic of Alexander the Great found in Pompeii in Italy. The mosaic is dated very early to 200 BCE during the Hellenistic period. It's now been lifted from the floor of a room in Pompeii, in a large aristocratic Pompeian house where it was being used as a work of art. We believe almost certainly that this incredible mosaic, which has 1.5 million stones originally in it, little coloured stones, to give it this definition, almost like resolution pixels on a computer screen. We believe it's a copy of a painting, maybe from the time of Alexander the Great. We know that this used to happen. The painting's long lost, but we do know that paintings would be replicated, as was sculptures in other materials during the Roman period when they were collecting a lot of the earlier Greek art. The Roman admiral and natural historian Pliny the Elder, he was living in the 1st century CE, perfectly summarizes this new culture of collecting and its alienation from the original notion of pure social function of art as it developed in Greece, um, as primarily a meaningful image. So he quotes, "We tapestry the walls of our galleries with old pictures, and we prize the portraits of strangers, while as to those made in honour of ourselves, we esteem them only for the value of the material, for some air to break up and melt, and so forestall the noose and slipknot of the thief. Thus it is that we possess the portraits of no living individuals, and leave behind us the pictures of our wealth, not of our persons." It's so modern, that statement, isn't it? In set, I've got an example of what Pliny was probably talking about from the same general period. It's a Roman room that's been reconstructed in the National Museum in Rome from an aristocratic villa in Rome, painted in the 1st century BCE. And you can see it's like a picture gallery with these kind of ancient Greek replicas of ancient Greek paintings around the walls. And here is this wonderful bronze portrait sculpture, what Pliny would refer to as a portrait of a stranger, of a foreigner. He was Ptolemy Apion, who was the last of the Hellenistic Egyptian rulers before the Romans took over control of North Africa and Egypt. And these were a series of sculptures found in the Villa of the Papyri Herculaneum, now replicated, by the way, in the J.P. Getty Museum in outside of Los Angeles on the coast there. I've been to it; it's amazing. This is now in Naples Museum, but you can see a sort of black African characteristics. So the passage by Pliny tells us several things about the Roman art market, which chronologically follows on from ancient Greece. There's great esteem for old masters, the old Greek painters. Expensive materials are often considered of higher value than the art itself, and art theft has become an issue. The Roman interest in collecting the old masters of earlier Greek art came about during their invasions and conquest of the Greek cities of southern Italy, Sicily, and Greece itself during the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE. Important, fine, and decorative art objects were looted from religious sanctuaries and public spaces, sounds familiar, and became striking visual signs of victory in the triumphal processions back in Rome. The original works were displayed in Rome's own temples and public places. Purpose-built art galleries appeared for the first time in Rome, and Roman aristocrats began to display replicas in their own private houses, villas, and gardens. You might be asking, where are the women? Well, one of the few named women artists of antiquity is Iaia of Cyzicus. I'll spell that for you. Iaia. Cyzicus, Cyzicus. And she was active during the centuries before the birth of Christ, the centuries BCE, during what we call the Roman Republican period before we move into Roman Empire. Pliny the Elder, we've referred to already, praises her skill. He wrote a kind of ancient art history, which is fascinating. He praises her skill in portraiture and panel painting, noting that she outperformed her male contemporaries in speed and quality. Yaia's success in a male-dominated field suggests that women could, albeit rarely, achieve professional recognition and commercial success in the ancient art market. Here's an example of a woman painter, not of Iaia necessarily, found in Pompeii, now in Naples Museum. And what she's doing, this is the woman painter. You can see she's got a little box, probably of pigments there. And the little figure down here, probably a kind of Cupid, is holding the painting like a wooden panel painting. She's painting this figure of Dionysus, the wine god. A couple of her friends are gazing on. This is probably a slave, a servant for her, because she's holding a fan and probably is there to come in and keep her cool in the Roman heat. The Roman statesman Cicero, writing in the 1st century BCE, provides further information about the reasons for collecting art in the Roman period. As for those terms, so this is a letter he's writing to his art advisor, Atticus, who's based in Athens. Cicero's back in Italy. As for those herms of yours in Pentelic marble with heads of bronze, about which you wrote me, they're already providing me in advance with considerable delight. And so I pray you send them to me as soon as possible. And also as many other statues and objects as seem to you, my italics, appropriate to that place. He's been talking about a villa that he owns in Italy and the different rooms of it, and to my interests and to your good taste. The inset object is the kind of object that he's talking about, although this is much more Roman. It's a realistic portrait of a banker. We know his name because it's inscribed on the pillar, found in a house in Pompeii, now in Naples, in the Museo Archaeological Nazionale, as so many objects are from the excavations at Pompeii and Herculaneum. So, analysing this text, as in the Pliny we looked at earlier, the high cultural status of materials, as well as their raw market value, is highlighted over and above their aesthetic properties. Cicero, as an art collector, is also interested in art which is site-specific, to use the modern term, i.e. appropriate to a place in the text. And it reflects also his own personality and interest. He's saying, I'd like you to find works that reflect me. But he also relies on the good taste of his Greek art advisor, or actually it's a Roman, but he knows Greece very well. Art advisor Atticus, which is a nickname meaning the Athenian. It's a reference to a degree of aesthetic appreciation as well as to his reliance on an art expert's opinion. Cicero, like many rich art collectors today, doesn't have time to learn about art. You're all doing this program to learn about art and advise these kind of high net worth individuals today, but it's already there in the ancient world. Cicero's words suggest that Atticus is selecting and supplying sculptures off the peg, as we call it, already made from distribution centres in Athens. There is archaeological evidence of sculptural workshops in Athens during its Roman occupation. These produce bronze and marble, what we call Neo-Attic or Neo-Athenian replications of earlier, older classical works and styles. And it's likely that these were the source of Atticus's purchases for Cicero. Along with the development of these secondary and replicative art markets in the world of ancient Roman patrons and Greek artists, there's also increasing evidence of auctions, especially to sell off war loot at the site of battle. Quote from Pliny on the slide: "For upon the sale of the spoil on that occasion," he's referring to the victory over Greek city of Corinth in 146 BCE, "King Attalus, who's a Hellenistic king living in the eastern Mediterranean, in what is modern Turkey, had purchased at the price of 6,000 denarii, huge amount of money, a painting of Father Liber, or the god of wine Bacchus, another name for him, by the named painter, famous Greek painter Aristides. Mummius, the Roman general, feeling surprised at the price and suspecting there might be some merit in it, of which he himself was unaware, in spite of the complaints of Attalus, broke off the sale and had the picture placed in the Temple of Ceres in Rome. The first instance, says Pliny, I conceive, of a foreign painting being publicly exhibited at Rome." So the word auction, by the way, is derived from the ancient Latin word augere, which means to increase in value. So in most auctions, the price increases until there's only one bidder with the highest price. There is another style of auction, by the way, called the Dutch auction, where the price decreases until someone actually puts up that. It's very stressful. They still use it on the flower market outside Amsterdam. I visited it before with our students. You have to get up very early in the morning. That's the trouble. So we haven't done it since, but it's very, very interesting to watch. Anyway, the earliest evidence of auctions, you have to forgive me because this is actually a very, very sexist quotation I'm about to make. So the earliest evidence for auctions comes from the Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, who describes how Babylonian virgins were sold at auction to the highest bidder, beginning with the most beautiful, and the profits of the early lots that made more money subsidized the dowries of the less attractive girls. Unquote. The Roman general Mummius, who embarrasses himself in the Pliny account I've just referred to, was in fact renowned for his lack of education and knowledge about art. As the following anecdote informs us, you can read this on the screen. Mummius was so lacking in culture that when he had captured Corinth and was arranging for the transportation to Italy of paintings and statues, which were masterpieces by the hands of the greatest artists, he warned those in charge of the transportation, we would call it logistics today, and you're going to learn more about that, that if they destroyed any of the statues and paintings, they'd have to replace them with new ones. Very funny. So this passage is a witty demonstration of the strikingly modern Roman attitude towards the notion of masterpieces, described in the Latin text, by the way, as perfectas picturis, or perfect pictures, as well as of the importance of authenticity in the art market. Sadly, in spite of Mummius's care to preserve the great art of classical Greece in Roman galleries, very few original works of art have survived from this period of antiquity. I have also inset in the slide a 19th century painting now in the d'Orsay, Paris, an imaginary painting of Mummius entering the ancient Greek city of Corinth that he conquered in 146 BCE. So he's in the background followed by his Roman army, holding the Roman standards. And in the foreground, we've got all these aristocratic women, Greek women. And you can also notice, if you look carefully, some of the kind of gilt bronze and bronze vessels that Corinth was very famous for, and which Mummius was going to loot and take back and sell on the art market back in Rome. We read about that in the sources. The precious metal sculptures and decorative art objects were melted down much later during the barbarian invasions of early Christian Rome, whilst the panel paintings were simply too fragile to survive the ravages of time during the Middle Ages, the medieval period. In the present day, today, unfortunately, there are still instances of the theft of art objects made of expensive or precious materials, which are then sold on for their raw material value. I'm going to show you one, and then I'm coming back to this slide. So, in 2005, the this Henry Moore bronze sculpture. Henry Moore, by the way, for those of you who haven't heard that name, he's arguably one of several great British modernist sculptors. And this was valued at over 3 million, as the caption says. It was stolen and sold as scrap metal. That's because the people who stole it realized they couldn't sell it on the open market because it would just ring alarm bells. And in London, we have this private institution that our students often work for, which deals with looted art. It's called the Art Loss Register. So you might find yourself working for that if you're interested. Anyway, and the scrap metal was valued at £1,500. Isn't that a sad story? It happens all too often, unfortunately. Just to come back to this slide. So basically what you're looking at on the right is a Roman marble copy, very typical in Roman replication of earlier Greek bronze statues, in this case of a young male athlete, made famously by a very famous sculptor Polykleitos in the 5th century BC. None of his original bronzes have survived. This one is an attempt to show what the original bronze might have look like, if you like. But original bronzes, by the way, were polished in ancient Greek and Roman times so that these would gleam. They'd have been amazing because most of these were seen out of doors. This was a Didicrys statue of an Athenian warrior that was dedicated to the goddess of Athena on the Acropolis in Athens. We know this from literary sources, but the original statue's lost. And it was one of the most famous statues in antiquity for reasons I can't go into now. And you can see, by the way, one of the reasons it's famous is a very early example of contrapposto, where a statue stands with the weight on one leg and it creates this beautiful sort of curvature up the body. And this is rediscovered in Renaissance Italy in particular. We'll come back to that. But it's just an example of replication. And just to go through, by way of conclusion, what we have learnt about the art market in antiquity. We've learnt that, as today, it's an exchangeable commodity with local and international, both locally and internationally. There are primary and secondary markets. It appears that works were made in, say, Athens, and then they got rid of on the second-hand market to the Etruscans and other people around the Mediterranean. There's an attraction to foreign art. Pliny talks about this. The Romans fall in love with Greek art. They're not artists themselves. First artist signatures occur in 6th century BCE Greece. Artists are paid. There's competition amongst artists and collectors. Artists become culture heroes. We're thinking about Zeuxis in 5th century BCE Athens with his cloak with his name embroidered in gold on the back. The famous competition with fellow artist Parrhasius. There are some women artists, very few, according to the literary accounts. There are inventories of art. There are catalogues, listing art collections. We've got lots of evidence of collecting and replication of older art as today. There are auctions. There are art advisors. And after the fall of the Roman Empire, the production of fine and decorative art objects was mainly limited to commissions for the churches of the new Christian religion. We see here this beautiful mosaic in an apse way above our heads. You'd see the image of Jesus Christ, omnipotens or pantocrator, the Greek word, all powerful, appearing very, very differently to what he becomes in Renaissance art as a more human, frail figure like ourselves. In the medieval period, Jesus was seen as equal to God, I won't go into the theology now, but he's quite a frightening figure, and you can see that there's still a little bit of the naturalistic drapery and chiarus and sort of, light and shade that we find in ancient Greek and Roman painting, but it's also gone back to a kind of more artificial frontality. I'm talking about art styles now, which this lecture isn't about. You're expected to know your art histories. And this is in this beautiful cathedral in Cefalù in the middle of the northern coast of Sicily. And some of you, more alert people, might think, oh, there's something a little bit kind of like Eastern and Islamic about a lot of this architecture and art. And that is because in Sicily, there was a big Muslim population. And before the Normans take over in the 11th, 12th century CE, and the Normans are Christians from France, they are the ones that invaded Great Britain, of course, Tower of London, but they're also down in Sicily and Italy, and they kind of use the Muslim population to work with them on art. And so, artistic patronage and money moves to the church in the medieval period. There's little evidence of any kind of dynamic art market on the level witnessed in ancient Rome, because Christianity saw material wealth and beauty as belonging only to God, to be stored and displayed in his public and private places of worship. In many ways, this medieval period was a return to the artistic culture of archaic and classical Greece, where the production of fine art and architecture was a similarly sacred activity. We must remember that even the vases that we've looked at were mainly used in the symposia, that's the Greek word for drinking parties, in honor of the god Dionysus. They were religious rituals. In the Roman world, however, the cheap labor of the slave economy, coupled with military imperialism, had fostered increasingly wealthy middle-class traders and merchants, themselves often freed slaves, with highly competitive culture and art collecting aspirations. This secular artistic activity all but ceased with the collapse of Roman Empire and the ensuing medieval period. And it was not until the Italian Renaissance, the word means the rebirth, the rinascimento of the ancient Greek and Roman world. It wasn't until then that families of aristocrats and nouveau riche merchant bankers, such as the Medici in Florence in Italy, began to rediscover the antique past. Mostly what they found were the Roman marble replications of classical and Hellenistic Greek originals. However, these rediscoveries stimulated the culture of competitive collecting, and not only the antique Roman past, but the secular artistic production and art market associated with it was reborn. Virtually every literary reference to art in the medieval period is in the context of church decoration. This begins to change in the late medieval period, with rural feudalism evolving into progressive city-states, with their emerging middle classes, and there are now increasing references to luxurious courtly living, such as in the 14th century papal palaces, 13th and 14th century papal palaces in Avignon in the south of France and Rome. You see this fantastic wall painting, not very well preserved, of a medieval hunt. You can see the beautiful hare in the middle of the forest there. This is in the Papal Palace in Avignon. And artist payment records and eyewitness accounts from this period refer to a taste for extremely fine decorative art objects, such as jewelry, tapestries, and furnishings, such as chairs and beds. There's also evidence of the export and import of expensive portable religious objects. So I'm finishing on this slide. Thomas de la Mare, Abbot of St Albans Cathedral, Hertfordshire in England. You can visit St Albans. It's an amazing ancient Roman city that becomes a very important medieval cathedral town. It's only 20 minutes by train from London. So Thomas de la Mare, and I've quoted this in the bottom of the slide, purchases a panel which had been painted in Lombardy in the north of Italy around Milan and places it above the main altar in St Albans, having first paid £45, 10 shillings and 8 pence for it and for its logistical transport from the north of Italy to St Albans, to London. This painting was presumably, by the way, in the international Gothic style, patronized by merchants and aristocrats as well as the church, emanating out of northern Italy. and travelling across the Alps to the papal court at Avignon and thence to England. It is interesting that Thomas de la Mare prefers the costly import from the centre of production in Lombardy, Italy, to the less desirable local versions being produced at the time in England. This is strong evidence for a competitive art market, with the wealthiest collectors from across Europe vying for the very best. Doesn't matter where it's from, logistics, you get it, just like today. Portable art, commodifiable art, becomes increasingly fashionable again, partly as a response to the constant moving around of the royal courts of London and Paris to their different country houses and urban palaces. In this early Renaissance or proto-Renaissance period, finely bound and illustrated books have equal status to art as we see it today, with Charles V of France in the 14th century being one of the greatest collectors of books. And we're reminded of the birth of Sotheby's in 1744 as an auctioneer, not of art, but of important libraries. Charles V of France and his brothers attracted artists from both Italy and Flanders in the Netherlands into France. And as an international movement, the Renaissance perhaps begins here, with the northern artists' exquisitely detailed renderings of nature, meeting the humanistic interest in the body of the Italians. We'll look at the implications of these stylistic and international evolutions for the modern history of the art market in part 2 of my talk. It's coming up. In the meantime, here's a very select bibliography for both parts of my lecture, in case any of you want to follow up what I've said in more depth. So I leave you with this bibliography and enjoy your break. Hope you enjoyed the lecture. Any questions you have, please feel free to email me or come and ask me at some point.